Can you guys hear me? Okay. Perfect. Welcome. This is the first breakfast and learn that Minutes Solutions and GetQuorum has put together. A lot of familiar faces in the room. If you guys are aware, we do professional third-party minute taking, specializing in the Toronto area. We work with over 700 condo clients now, and we have about 100 trained staff. About a year ago, we officially partnered with GetQuorum, who actually, one of the main issues that we saw was meetings and boards not being able to actually meet quorum because proxy voting wasn't a thing. When then GetQuorum understood that was an issue, so they developed this software. We have a lot of the same clients, so we decided to work together so we could put on some of these events, hopefully for your benefit. There's a lot of questions, a lot of talk that comes out of meetings. A lot of clients ask us about certain questions that seem to be trending. One of the ones now, too, marijuana, which we're not speaking about today, and the other one is EV charging stations with the proliferation of electric vehicles. So today we're going to touch upon that. We brought in a couple of industry experts from Pacific Light and Energy and Switch, and hopefully with them as a compendium, we'll be able to facilitate all of your EV charging questions and needs. So without further ado, we're gonna jump right in here. Ideally, if you could keep your questions towards the end, we're gonna have 30 minutes for a Q&A, but that way it'll just make it a little bit more sequential. We can get through the crux of the presentation, and then welcome any questions thereafter.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carter Lee. I'm with Switch, and as Patrick mentioned, we provide services along with Pacific for turnkey electric vehicle charging management, specifically for the multi-res setting. So just from a show of hands, who here has had a tenant request EV charging in their buildings? Okay, so pretty much everybody. So Miss, what's your name? Melissa? Melissa, what have you experienced and what have your tenants asked you in the last little bit?
We have deeded parking spaces. It's an older building. We've had requests from two owners who have ordered solely electric vehicles. And so we're looking into charging stations and trying to find a solution which is going to serve us down the road for a number of years because we do have limited electrical capacity. It's an older building.
Yeah, we see that a lot. And sir, your name? Oh, together? Okay. What about you, miss?
We have a large building at the Pinnacle Center and 5 levels of underground garage.
Okay, a big parking lot.
Will be a challenge to address that.
Okay, yeah. So, those are very different kind of layouts and very different requirements, but our solutions try to cover as much of the spectrum as possible because there are unique challenges to both the deeded charging and shared charging stations, if you will. So, I'm sure we all know this. People are buying a lot of electric vehicles recently, and a big reason from it is simply the availability of these mass market vehicles like the Tesla Model 3, the Bolt, the Leaf. And the purchase incentives have definitely made it very attractive for people to consider electric vehicles as an option. But because of this, we're faced with the challenges we're here all for. How do we provide electric vehicle charging in condominiums that were designed 30 years ago, that didn't even have a thought of having to provide these type of services for these buildings? And, recently through the Condo Act, that was recently enacted, it has made it a lot easier for condominium owners and tenants to request these charging, but it makes it difficult for the property managers now to satisfy this demand. And that's what we're primarily here for. So as I mentioned, there's unique challenges for electric vehicle drivers and for the property managers. For the electric vehicle drivers, if they live in a condominium and they don't have their own charging spot, it's a real pain in the butt. They have to go somewhere, drive somewhere half an hour, wait there for an hour or two, and drive back. And it's, for someone like me who lived in a condo that didn't have their own charging spot, I can attest to this, that really not an ideal experience. So, but at the same time, these buildings that we're managing here are 30, 40 years old. They don't have the power requirements. They're not the conduits are not wired for these type of installations. What do we do? Who pays for it? Those are all common challenges that we see. And for us, we'd like to break it down into two categories. The ones that you mentioned about private deeded charging, and then there's the ones that are for shared common use charging, like in the visitor sections. Both have their pros and cons, and we're going to explore those in more detail. So when we talk about deeded private charging, it's definitely the most convenient for the tenants to use. They have their own charging station, they put in their own sub-metering, they're done. The issue with that is that who's going to pay for that? Who's going to pay for the conduit to be wired all the way from the electrical room to their own personal parking spot? Depending on the distance of that conduit, it could be up to $20,000 or $30,000 for the installation. And I would be hard-pressed to find any condo board who'd be willing to foot that price. So, the idea is that person pays for that, but even if that person decides to pay for that, then they take a valuable energy on the panel that's barely any left, So maybe the first 2 or 3 or 4 people who put in deeded charging stations are fine, but what about the 5th person that wants that deeded charging spot and there's just simply no more power? Are they the person to actually pay for a brand new panel so they can have enough space? How is it fair for the first 5 people to have that charging spot and the 6th person, essentially they're out of luck? So that is something that you need to consider in your specific property. How many people are really asking for it, and how do you envision people actually growing, and how many people are actually going to use it in the future is really, really important if you decide to go this route. Now, for the shared common use charging, the idea of putting 1 or 2 charging stations in the visitor parking lots, the cost could be a lot less because you can actually pick where you want to install the charging stations, and because if they're close to the electrical room, the cost could be dramatically lower than the install if you were to do deeded. Now, the issue with these shared common use charging stations is that everybody loiters. The idea is that if a guy goes there and parks for 6 hours and then they're busy doing other things that weekend, they leave it parked for another 12 and nobody else can use it. How do you work around those people's schedules if you have 6 people who need to charge, only 2 chargers? That is a real pain in the butt. And you also see people without even EVs simply parking there because this seems to be the closest parking spot they have. So loitering is something that is commonly faced and is something that we are actively addressing in our solution. So this might be familiar to a lot of people, but for people who aren't familiar with the designations of the charging stations, there's 3 types of charging stations. There's what we call the level 1 charging station, which is essentially a wall plug. These things literally take about 60 hours to charge a car. Not ideal, but if people do only commute 20, 30 kilometers a day, and you just plug it in every night, that could be sufficient. We don't think it's ideal, but depending on the logistics of your infrastructure, that could be an option. This level 2 is something that we see the most often in the condominium space. Most condominiums have 240 volt outlets, sources with enough power, like 40 amps, to power these charging stations. And they are a lot quicker. They're about 7 times quicker. So you can get a full charge worth about 400 to 500 kilometers of range in 6 to 10 hours. So like overnight, essentially, versus 60. The level 3 or the DC fast chargers are the ones that you see on the highways. These ones require 480 volt sources, 100 amps, not something that is readily available in the condominium setting. So, and plus the cost of these things are enormous. For a typical install with civil and everything is upwards to $100,000. So really not something that is feasible in in an existing condominium building. So what do we do? Well, we try to solve all those problems I just mentioned, specifically for the loitering issues. The idea is that if you're going to put in charging stations in the shared visitor common area, do you really want your security guard or your front desk guy to check up every half an hour? No, of course not. They're already busy doing other things. So what we've done is put in a camera system that physically monitors the location of the parking spot. This is a very simple camera system. It's about $500, compared to the actual installation of the package. And it actually is able to enforce the parking spot. So when you have an electric vehicle that stays there longer than they should, because we have your payment information and we have your license and everything already in the system, we'll just charge you a loitering penalty. And this is something that could be decided how much from the property managers themselves. It might just be a stern warning, but at least we're able to recognize people who are exploiting them and loitering the spaces. Because we can actually enforce the location of the parking space, we could introduce unique functionalities like scheduling. Say if you needed to go to your cottage up north on Saturday and you needed a full charge on a Friday night, you can actually book ahead of time, like a week ahead of time on a Friday night, to know that you'll have that spot for you, so you'll get that full charge to go to up north to your cottage. Now, this applies to both the shared and the deeded parking spots. I say more for the deeded parking spots. There's this thing called load management, and it's something that you don't actually have to buy. It comes built into every smart charging station right now. And the idea is that if you have an 100 amp panel, typically you could only put 2 or 3 charging stations there. But because you can tell them to talk to each other via Wi-Fi or Ethernet cable, you can tell it to say that even if you have 5 or 10 chargers, that only use 100 amps of that service. So this way, you're not limited to just 3 or 4 charging stations. You could go up to 10. And the idea is that 10 will automatically be intelligently charged so that everybody gets a full charge by the end of the next morning. So this is really important for if you're going to put in deeded parking spots to prevent running out of power after 2 or 3 installations, and as well as for shared, because you can put more and more of them without worrying about adding a new panel. It's important to recognize that this technology is changing very, very quickly. You don't want to put too much money in this investment because who knows in 5, 10 years what it could be. So it's really important to understand how your charging stations are being used. So that's why we provide consumer behavior analytics to see, when they're charging it, how they're charging it. Do I really need to put in 2 more charging stations if they're only being used 20% of the time? So, that's something that we always encourage. Don't go all in. Try 1 or 2 charging stations. See how it goes. And if you need more, you can always add more in the future. But understand how your tenants are using the charging stations now before you overspend on something that could be obsolete in 10 years. So we're part of this group of manufacturers and service providers that believe in an open, flexible platform. What I mean by that is, think of a cell phone. You have a cell phone, it's an iPhone, and you want to switch between Rogers and Bell because Rogers is giving you a really crappy deal. But your phone is locked to Bell or Rogers. So what do? Not much, right? So the same idea. Our chargers are open charge point protocol compatible, meaning that you can simply swap out our SIM card and put in others if you feel that our service is not adequate. Now, half the industry supports this and half the industry doesn't. So I strongly encourage you to try to purchase something that is the open platform. Because if you choose one that is closed platform, you're essentially buying that charging station and that service for life. I think the analogy in the real estate industry is those elevators. You know, those elevators that have to have a special repairman to repair versus those elevators that anybody can repair. So, you know, I think this gives you that flexibility of not having to be locked in with a service provider forever, and you get to choose between which hardware is more suitable for your needs. Yes?
It's not even the repair about the elevators you said. I talked to a technician, said you can use another company, however, they will have to order parts from us.
So there's no getting around it, right? Yeah. You know, do you want to be that, do you want to buy that elevator, or do you want to be able to just call somebody and fix it? It's not even the price sometimes. It's just there's nobody available, you know, to repair it in the week or two because you have to get that special repairman. You know, those are things that we really advocate. So we provided a list of all the different charging hardware providers and the software providers. And, you know, we're very transparent in our pricing and very transparent in their pricing. And what we offer is extremely competitively priced in all aspects. Because it's much more than just buying the charging stations themselves. You know, if you're going to start collecting money from payments, the amount of transaction percentage that people take, you know, some of them take up to 15%. You know, and you have to pay for a networking fee for each charging station just for them to be online. And that adds up when you're charging $300 a station per year. You know, so if somebody's not even using it, you're paying $300 a year for it to just sit there. So when you purchase these stations and these services, try to consider not only the cost of the installation and the hardware, but also the operating cost, you know, the monthly bill that you're paying to these service providers. I think it's really important to consider. So we're deploying in 200 different sites right now across Southern Ontario, primarily through Skyline, Quadrille, and Windmill, in both multi-res and commercial and public destination charging stations. You know, I think we're all fairly familiar with this new condo act that is been implemented in May 1st, but you know, we can just go over it really, really briefly. Maybe you guys could help me out if you have read it or you haven't read it. But essentially, they break it down into two different scenarios. You know, the first scenario is if the corporation, the condo board decides to put in shared charging stations. You know, and the revision to the Condo Act has made it easy enough that if you satisfy the requirements of it being 10%, lower than 10% of the common annual expenses of the corporation, and if the condo board deems it not detrimental to the building, then essentially all you have to do is put a notice up for 60 days, and then you can go for it. You know, but if it is above 10%, or if the condo board deems it not necessarily detrimental, maybe it's just neutral, they're not really, it's tough to say, then you would put it up for notice for people to request a vote. So then they have 60 days for 15% of the corporation to request a vote. Now, once this happens, you know, then for the actual vote itself, the quorum has to be reached. If quorum is not reached, then you can go through the install. If quorum is reached and the voters vote for the install, of course it goes to install, but the voters, if they vote against it, then you get a no install. So if you see all the arrows, there's a lot of ways to get to install, and there's very few things that will actually get to the no install. So this makes it really easy if the condo board really wants to have the charging stations. And this is a change from what the rules were before. So the other scenario for installation is for people who want to put in their own private charging stations, you know, and that is, again, a lot simpler than it was before. The idea is that the owner applies formally in a written application to the board, and the corporation has within 60 days to respond to it. If they think it's okay, and it's not contrary to, you know, the declaration, it's not contrary to the electrical safety code, and it's not contrary to the property structural integrities, then essentially they have to accept the owner's request to install the charging stations. You know, within those three criteria, if they don't fall, then they are able to essentially provide that response to the owners, and then the owners then have a 6-month appeal process. So again, it makes it a lot easier for the personal tenants who do want to install these charging stations to be able to do so. So maybe we can come up and we can follow up with all the questions. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Carter. That was awesome. And Rob and Sean. So now we're going to do a bit of a Q&A. As Sean and Rob mentioned here, that they follow a lot of paradigm shifts within the industry and have a lot of experience with multi-residential condos in terms of power and energy and anything related. So any questions about that, I'll kind of quarterback it and give it to them. Carter, that was great. I think you covered a lot of the topics there. And any questions for Carter regarding anything EV more specific or Switch's solution, I'll lead that to Carter. And then before we wrap up, I know that some people got to get going here, so feel free to leave. We're not gonna hold you hostage any longer. So, but if there's any questions, which I'm sure there will be, we recorded the seminar and we're gonna make that available. If there's anybody that you want to share that with, we'll have a link available. I have some cards and some one-pagers there with my contact information. So if there's anything that you guys want to discuss that isn't covered in Q&A or next steps on potential audits or installations, feel free to reach out to me as well. But I think most of the questions will probably be directed to you. So I'll give you back the mic and I'll let you guys go. And if you have questions, I can actually walk around with a microphone, as it will be easier to hear that way, because it is a pretty big room. So why don't we get started?
Okay. I was just going to ask, so you are not suggesting that the fastest charging station, the fast charge one, is appropriate for condo buildings because of the electrical service that's typically there? Is that correct, that you would recommend the second level charger instead?
I think there's maybe a misunderstanding of the fast and the slows. I think when most people talk about fast, we're talking about the level 2 charging stations. You know, when your tenants are saying, I want the fast charging station, they're probably referring to the fact that they don't want to plug it into the wall, essentially. So it is fast, and it's 7 times faster than a wall outlet. It's just not the super, super fast ones.
1 to 2 hours we're talking about. Having basically need to plug it in.
Usually for a full charge, yes, correct, yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you a question. Our building is from 1972. It's an old building, so all the parking spots are exclusive use. So question the scenario if one of the owners right now will come and say, I'm planning to purchase a vehicle. So what's going to be the best scenario for the board, kind of recommendation from the management to install, either to install on because we have, the corporation has their own parking spots inside and outside of the building. So maybe the best solution will be to install outside of the building a couple of spots. And since we don't know how many will be, and the building, like I said, it's a more elderly population there. So we don't know how long it will take for the turnaround until a lot of people purchase. So, and also the other question, if let's say, if he said, no, I want to use on my exclusive parking spot, the parking station, do we have to? Does the board has to actually to comply, or?
Yeah, great question. To your second point, I mean, if they pay for it, then according to the Condo Act, it's hard to say no. But I think they might be surprised about the bill that they get, depending on how far their parking spot is to the electrical room. I find it hard to believe people will pay $20,000, $30,000, like the price of a car, to put in a charging station because of the distance from where they need to do it. But if you do decide to provide that model of private, I strongly emphasize you guys to use the same company charging stations. And the reason why I say that is because those load management capabilities of being able to limit and all those things, you don't have to pay anything for those things. They all come built into the machines themselves, but they have to be the same machines to be able to talk to each other. So, you know, if you are going to let people install a charging station, I would suggest you tell them that which brand to buy because of it. Because if one guy has a Tesla charger, one guy has an EV box charger, one guy has a whatever charger, none of them are going to be able to talk to each other, and then you're going to deal with your issues of load management. But if they all use the same charging station, and I'm not telling you which one to buy because they all can provide that functionality, then you can manage the load without actually buying a smart panel or something like that. You know, so that's really, really important if you're going to go that route.
Yeah, sure. Let me just start here, and then I'll come up to you.
Can, if you buy first or you first have an individual charging station, can you later on add the smart part that you, if you run out of capacity, let's say after 5 or 6, and you want to add another 10, can you then add this easy to a regular charging station? Yes or no?
No. But the challenge is that, you know, people think that the smart and what they call the dumb, which is the non-network ones, the price difference is humongous. They're really not at this point. The pricing for electric vehicle chargers have dropped dramatically. You know, before these...
Do you own it outright, or do you have to pay a monthly fee?
To use the charging stations? It depends on the service provider. Like for us, our chargers are Wi-Fi enabled. So if you can provide a Wi-Fi signal, you don't have to pay for anything. You know, you can use your own internet to connect your charging stations or an Ethernet cable.
Once you pay whatever the amount is, $500 for the charging station,
Yeah.
from there on there is no further monthly charge for that.
If it's a personal use one.
Right.
If it's a personal use one. There's this tricky element of how the condo board and, you know, how they're going to pay for their own consumption. The typical route is a sub-meter, right? You know, so you put a sub-meter beside their own deeded parking station. That usually solves the problem. But sometimes, due to the complexities of the installation of the sub-metering, those charging stations themselves actually have pretty accurate meters. They're just not qualified to to charge on a kilowatt hour basis because they're not approved by Measurement Canada. So what we've seen is that the condo board can keep track of the usage of what these people use and just charge them a flat rate as long as they're not something astronomical. So if they're using about $30 worth of electricity and they charge them $30 a month, this way you don't actually have to sub-meter them per se, but it's just an easier way of doing it. Yeah.
Just a question in regards to the electrical cars. Is Tesla and all the different brands of cars, is the plug the same for every one of them?
That's a great question, and it's a really, really great question, and we get that a lot. So Tesla has their own special outlet, but when people buy Teslas, they're given a pack of adapters for free. You know, so Tesla could actually use everybody else's chargers, just everybody else can't use Tesla charging stations. So this is why we always encourage people to buy these universal charging stations, because the Tesla ones can use them fine. They just have a little clip that clips onto their car that they plug that in. But you can't do it vice versa. You know, so when you buy these charging stations, there's a universal plug that is compatible across all companies. Yeah.
Actually, I have a question regarding the, because earlier you mentioned something about having to have a camera. And isn't there a way to design in such a way that, you know, if somebody wants to use it, there is some kind of a panel where, you know, if the residents, you know, live in the building, they have to have, you know, be able to open, yeah, because otherwise, I mean, it's a problem, right? My other comment is that I think, you know, for some of the existing buildings, if you're putting in a charging station, I mean, just bear in mind for barrier-free, you know, one of your residents may be, you know, even though they drive, they may be barrier-free. So where you put it is pretty important to kind of keep that in mind, I think.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And the question is very, very valid. Have you experienced something like that before?
No, because I'm a designer, so I work with, you know, with architects and when we do planning, because the barrier-free, in the building code is pretty strong right now. So everything that you do from, whatever you plan for, you have to allow for it. So, but I'm not sure exactly in the building code right now where this stands, in terms of, what kind of changes they're making. Because, for architects and designers, architects especially when they're designing some of the newer buildings now, right? I don't know, where it stands as far as that goes.
Yeah, so typically you would have them have like safety bollards in front of them, so that in case somebody, rams it into the station, like you're not going to break the station or make it explode because you're doing what's somewhat higher voltage. So, that's the safety concern as well. And I would recommend people putting in cord management systems because the charging stations are very, very reliable. It's just that people tend to forget them, like unplugged, put it on the floor, and then it gets run over essentially. Like if they're going to break, that's 99% of the time it's because they left it on the floor and somebody ran it over, essentially.
Well, it's not so much that, it's the space that you have to require for the person to be able to get out and then be able to kind of...
Oh, I see.
Yeah. That's all very key, right?
I see.
So for existing buildings, in the challenge, I think, for some of you, when you're doing something like that, you should consider that obviously the building code, just to make sure.
Yeah, and we'd be happy to provide those kind of assessments as well, like because we provide free site assessments for individual properties if you want to just look if it makes any sense logistically. But to your first point, it's a really good point. Why do you need a camera system? And we don't necessarily push for that at all. The idea is that the issue is not just they're charging longer than they should. The idea is that even when they're done charging and the charger stops, because they're busy doing other things, they leave it parked in that spot for the next 8 hours. So they're not actually consuming electricity, just nobody else can use it essentially. And so that's the issue that the charging stations cannot control themselves. Yeah.
Do you recommend that buildings have a power audit done before installing load sharing equipment?
Absolutely. I mean, we can do it, directly or through Pacific. I think that's definitely to understand the limitations of how much you have. If you have enough power for 20 charging stations, then you probably don't need to go through the fuss of having these shared common use ones. But chances are, if your building's older than 20 years old, there's probably not a lot of energy left to give that kind of power.
Now, I don't know very much about the charging stations, so maybe this is an obvious question, but we would like to install stations where they can pay with a credit card at the condo. And how would that system work? How would, do we hook it up to our own electricity and the condo gets reimbursed? How does that system work?
Great question.
I'm coming, Carter.
Thank you for running around here. Maybe I'll come more towards there so you don't have to go back and forth. But so there's a few ways of doing it. The easiest way is to tie a tap card to that tenant's credit card. So the idea is that they would go up there, kind of like your tap for everything. You would tap to turn it on and tap to turn it off. And all the billing and everything is taken care of by us, essentially. We would pay you for the amount of energy that they used, and if you decide to make a margin off of that, that's up to you as well. So our service is we take a 10% transaction fee. The 90% usually we break it down to 50% goes to cover the cost of electricity, and the 40% profit goes to you guys, essentially. Yeah.
It's actually a two-part question. Everything in condominiums requires maintenance. Obviously, in today's technology, it may or may not be vandal-free. Do you have a maintenance package that goes along with your service? And if so, can it be fully comprehensive so we don't have extra components that we're going to have additional billings for?
Yeah, so great question again. So because the shared model, like we get paid on a transactional basis, it's really in our incentive to keep them running. You know, so our O&M package is completely covered for as long as you have those chargers in place. If the tenants decide to purchase their own charging stations, they're typically covered by a manufacturer's 3-year warranty. And the installation warranty is dependent on, you know, the contractor who puts it in.
After 3 years, what happens? Can you buy continued extension?
So if you're offering our service, then it never ends, essentially, because we want to have those machines on, essentially. You know, like, we don't make any money if those machines are broken, essentially. But for the people who just buy them outright for their own personal use, they're covered by 3-year manufacturer warranties that they would essentially deal with. Because if they put it in themselves, if it breaks, it's like their own TV, you know, they're gonna have to buy a new one.
I know the provincial government had sort of a grant that they gave to people to help install chargers in their private homes. I realize things may be changing with the change of government, but I was just wondering if there is any assistance that's still available, that would be available to condominium owners to help with the costs.
We have a pretty educated crowd. I like this. You're absolutely right. There's that incentive for home use that provides 50% of the installation and 50% of the hardware, but that's only for, you know, residential home use, not for multi-res. There was talk of a multi-res package. I mean, in March they released a $5 million infrastructure for workplaces. And I think they were going to roll out to this. I'm not sure what the policy changes are going to be now. I mean, there was talk before, but, you know, things have changed quite dramatically. Yeah.
The question, I don't know, maybe you already answered it, but the main disadvantage of the electrical system and the electric vehicle, it's when you're out of power. So what happens if there is no power? And there are some areas that they have, power outages like more frequently. And I understand that you cannot really connect it to the system, to the generator, to the emergency generator to the building. Yeah. So in this case, what happens if, for example, there is a power outage for 3 days that happened a couple of years ago? So what the solution?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't get charged, but I mean, the same ideas as a backup generator is like there's certain plugs that are dedicated for the red plugs, right, that are powered by the generator. If you really needed to power your car, you could plug a 110 plug into the power generator, like connected 110 outlets, essentially, you know. So as long as you could find a plug that is powered by the backup generator, it can charge it. Every car comes with a 110 volt adapter. You know, it comes built in. Yeah.
Most generators are geared just to handle emergency lighting.
Yeah.
Not handle.
Yeah.
Then charging.
Absolutely.
So you might be better off just buying a little portable generator. If there's a power failure, you can always plug your car.
And that's when you can go to the public ones, you know, those public super fast charging stations, like on the highways. There's quite a few, there's hundreds now in Toronto, like it's cropped up everywhere. So if need be, that's still an option to go, the idea of go fill up somewhere else, you know. Yeah.
If you're doing common shared charging stations, do you, as a company, based on your experience, have a ratio in terms of how many should be put in place relative to the number of units that you have?
I think that's a very, very good question. And typically what we've seen is you should start with 2, because putting 1 or 2 is pretty much the same price because you have to wire the conduits. And that's with the assumption that you have about 10 electric vehicle owners in that space. So that'll scale to probably like 10 to 20 electric vehicle charging owners. And from what we've seen, that's going to probably be good for the next few years. And the idea, like I mentioned before, is technology is changing so fast that you don't necessarily want to overdo it at this point. You know, learn how they're using it from all the software and the information that we give you, you know, and then in a few years' time decide whether it's worth adding a third or the fourth. Because it's not necessarily just the charging stations, the cost, right? Like, where are you going to find 3 or 4 more parking spots to give, you know? Most of these visitor parking spots are written in their declaration that you can't reallocate them. There's so many hurdles that you'd have to jump through to just find those spots. So, you know, if you don't have to overdo it right now, don't. Yeah. Yeah.
I get that most of your conversation is going on the e-vehicle. However, I do have 2 residents who are constantly at me about their e-bike. The board at this time is already discussing it, and they're with me. However, the comment is that we can't give you any information because now under the condominium authority, we now have to make testament of how many we're doing and whatever in accordance to our status certificate. I was advised by them that I'm approximately 21 cents per charge on an e-bike. Can I write you an $11 check now for the year? Are these figures accurate for an e-bike versus an e-vehicle?
So those electric assisted bicycles, is that what you mean by an e-bike? Okay. 13 cents per kilowatt hour, 2 kilowatt hours per month, they said?
So she said.
Probably a little more than that, but like, you know, I'd probably say like $1 or $2, but you know, it depends on how you want to do it. I mean, essentially, are they proposing to use a common amenity to charge it?
That's what they're doing at this time.
Okay, I see. It's definitely under like $5 a month. I don't know if it's 13 cents, but you know, if you want, I don't think they're compatible with the car charging stations, because I was going to say you can at least measure how much electricity they're using from the car charging ports. I mean, you could, I guess, sub-meter one of those machines, but at this point, I don't think it's that big of a deal.
But well, this individual, I mean, she's talking about $11 check per year.
Oh, per year, okay.
Me that it may be $5 a month, which in my calculations is $60.
Yeah.
If I get numerous people doing that, it could add up, and everybody else is paying.
Yeah, and she's probably assuming, or he is probably assuming, I don't know, remember that. Okay. Yeah, okay. That they're charging overnight, which is a big difference, right? Like it's 5 cents per kilowatt hour at night versus 13. Like I know it's 15 cents during the day, so that's a huge difference depending on how you calculate.
When the bike isn't in use, it's always plugged in, which means the charge is already done.
Yeah.
Somebody should be courteous enough for others and go down there and unplug it, since it's plugged into a common area spot that they have chosen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think those are unique challenges even to our use cases.
It's okay.
Yeah.
You've mentioned a couple things. One that there's public stations that are opening up more and more, especially in the GTA. Also that the technology is changing relatively fast. As a condo manager, am I better to hedge my bets that in a decade, like right now it seems the government's trying to download this onto either the condo or the individual owner. Do I hedge my bets that in a decade that this is going to be really pervasive throughout the province and that this won't really be an issue for me?
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. I think the issue is not so much satisfying the demand for the tenants, but also protecting your property values. You know, when people are going to ask to buy, you know, a unit in your properties or rent a unit in the properties, the question that comes up more and more common now is like, do you have charging? You know, and the cost of putting in 1 or 2 charging stations, like on a shared basis, is really not a lot. And to be able to check that box in the future for the next 10 years, to say like, yes, we do, I think, personally, I think it's worth it, because I mean, 10 years is a long time to wait for a technology to be proven outright. And if the risk is $5,000, $10,000 at most, I think it's worth protecting your property values in that way. But that's just a personal opinion.
You're talking about the low cost of investing in 1 or 2 units. What is the level 2 cost average right now to install in a condo? A shared?
It's a great question. I think ideal scenario where it's next to the electrical room, it's possible to do it under $5,000 for sure.
Let's say a 100-foot run from the electrical room to where it's at.
8,000? It's for the install. So these charging stations have, like I said, have dropped dramatically. One charging station used to be around, a smart one used to be around $4,000. Now they're selling for $1,500. You know, these are like the TVs that were like, 10 grand 10 years ago, Yeah. It's very minimal because the conduit has been run. I think it's important to put in like 2-inch conduit instead of 1.5 inches. Yeah, or even thicker if you can, because the cost of the material is very minimal. Once the work is done, you just run another wire through. Yeah.
Or to run a sub-panel.
Yes, exactly. To rub exactly. I was just about to say it. Yeah, one of the things, and you talked about hedging your bet earlier about where the industry's going. One of the things that we can provide is you don't necessarily have to install all the charging stations at once, like Carter had said. You can also take the proactive step of roughing it in. So like our company would come in, we take the measurements, see what your load is, see what your future potential is on how many charging stations you actually could use. And then we could rough in boxes throughout all the P levels. And then from there you can branch off, whether it's visitors or whether it's deeded spots. You could run them from those rough-in spots to the spots when they're ready. So that's one of the other things you can do is just get the rough-in ready, see what your capacity can be for the future, and that's something we can help put together for you with Carter's help as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
I just have ideas. For your, when you mentioned something about the, somebody charging their car and they leave the plug-in, is there any way that you can have an app that's built in so that when it's finished and it just keeps calling that person?
A great idea, and that's actually, that's what we do essentially. We provide the software, the hardware, and all these things to help run it. The simplest things is use a tap card, but if you have a reservation system, you can go into our platform and see what the schedule is like. For a lot of common amenities in a condominium, like your gym or your tennis court or whatever, the same idea, and you can book it ahead of time. So all those things that you talked about is like part of something that we provide to notify the people who are, essentially loitering there, and to notify people once that spot has been freed up. It's like, oh, now the space has been liberated. Now you can park there. You could put it yourself in a queue. Yeah.
We're going to take a couple more questions, but Pacific and Switch and GetQuorum and Minutes Solutions are going to stick around after for anything that goes along. But some people are getting up and leaving, so as everyone's got some busy days here. So feel free to get up if you guys have any questions. Like I said, we're going to take a couple more here with Carter up front, and then we'll stick around and let everyone sort of go their own ways.
So you mentioned that the Condo Act has made it easier to install these stations, but in what situations have you come into where it's still kind of difficult? Like maybe an amendment needs to be passed in order for that condo to, like any example condominiums that maybe fall into that category?
Yeah, I mean, the amendment to the declaration is probably the hardest thing, right? You get an 80% quorum. It is what it is, but I think what we've seen is if the condo board really wants to make it happen, they'll find a spot that they're willing to trade for, if they want it to happen. I realize the logistics of every condo building is different, but if they can use the visitor spot, they can reallocate a loading zone spot. There's a lot of ways of doing it, and I think, again, like if you wanted it to happen, it's a possibility. And if Thomas and Laura could just stand up, like afterwards, if you have questions, like they're part of Switch as well, so they can help you answer those questions. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll take one more, and then we'll break.
Thanks. Next year, we're supposed to, effective July 1st, report, the mandatory reporting is my understanding, for your energy use. And, you know, if this goes crazy, is there any accommodation for the fact that you are using or providing the electric charging stations? Because right now, to my understanding, it's strictly based on the volume of units, and that may create issue for a lot of people.
You guys have any thoughts on that, or?
The only thing I know is that you do acquire more lead credits, anywhere from 50 credits for the building. If you are taking the initiative to install energy efficient anything, whether it's lighting, HVAC, or EV charging stations, it shows your commitment to being going green for the building, so you do get lead credits towards that. The lead credits usually fall more on commercial buildings, industrial buildings, but so right now it's kind of up in the air with what's available, especially with the change in government. So that's definitely something we can look into a little bit more and get back to you if we can grab your information. Okay.
Awesome.
Thanks so much again for coming, guys. As we mentioned, we do love putting these on for people, especially when they are helpful and informational. So EV was one that we saw a lot of, so we decided to focus on that. But if you guys have any other questions or any questions about trends or paradigms happening within the industry, we're happy to host things like this. We do like it. It's a good chance for us to see a lot of our clients, which unfortunately, with busy lives and property managers having a lot going on, it's not something we get to do as often as we'd like. I know that GetQuorum feel the same way, and as we continue working with you guys, I'm sure the sentiment will continue with our partners, Switch and Pacific. So thanks so much again. We're going to stick around. Feel free to do the same, and we'll see you guys soon.